Hello everybody. Today Honey is going to read a few chapters of Wayside School Book 1, Sideways Stories from Wayside School, written by Sachar and illustrated by Tim Houch. Chapter 1. Mrs. Gorf. Mrs. Gorf had a long tongue and pointed ears. She was the meanest teacher in Wayside School. She taught the class on the 30th story. If you children are bad, she warned, or if you answer a problem wrong, I'll wiggle my ears, stick out my tongue, and turn you into apples. Mrs. Gorf didn't like children, but she loved apples. Joe couldn't add. He couldn't even count. But he knew that if he answered a problem wrong, he would be turned into an apple. So he copied from John. He didn't like to cheat, but Mrs. Gorf had never taught him how to add. One day, Mrs. Gorf caught Joe copying John's paper. She wiggled her ears, frisked her white one, then her left, stuck out her tongue, and turned Joe into an apple. Then she turned Joe into an apple for letting Joe cheat. Hey, that isn't fair, said Todd. John was only trying to help a friend. Mrs. Gorf wiggled her ears, first her right one, then her left, stuck out her tongue, then turned Todd into an apple. Does anybody have an opinion? She asked. Nobody said a word. Mrs. Gorf laughed and placed the 3 apples on her desk. Stephen started to cry. He couldn't help it. He was scared. I do not allow crying in my classroom, said Mrs. Gorf. She wiggled her ears, first her right one, then her left, stuck out her tongue, then turned Stephen into an apple. For the rest of the day, the children were absolutely quiet. And when they went home, they were too scared even to talk to their parents. But Joe, John, Todd, and Stephen couldn't go home. Mrs. Gorf just left them on the desk. They were able to talk to each other, but they didn't have much to say. Their parents were very worried. They didn't know where their children were. Nobody seemed to know. The next day, Kathy was late for school. As soon as she walked in, Mrs. Gorf turned her into an apple. Paul sneezed during class. He turned into an apple. Nancy said, God bless you, when Paul sneezed. Mrs. Gorf wiggled her ears, first her right one, then her left, stuck out her tongue, and turned Nancy into an apple. Terence fell out of his chair. He was turned into an apple. Mauricia tried to run away. She was halfway to the door as Mrs. Gorf's right ear began to wiggle. Then she reached the door. Mrs. Gorf's left ear wiggled. Mauricia opened the door and had one foot outside when Mrs. Gorf stuck out her tongue. Mauricia became an apple. Mrs. Gorf picked up an apple from the floor and put it on her desk with the others. Then a funny thing happened. Mrs. Gorf turned around and fell over a piece of chalk. The 3 Erics laughed. They were all turned into apples. Mrs. Gorf had a dozen apples on her desk. Joe, John, Todd, Stephen, Kathy, Paul, Nancy, Terence, Mauricia, and the 3 Erics. Eric Fry, Eric Bacon, and Eric Ovens. Louis, the yard teacher, walked into the classroom. He had missed the children at recess. He had heard that Mrs. Gorf was a mean teacher, so he came up to investigate. He saw the 12 apples on Mrs. Gorf's desk. I must be wrong, he thought. She must be a good teacher if so many children bring her apples. He walked back down to the playground. The next day, a dozen more children were turned into apples. Louis, the yard teacher, came back into the room. He saw 24 apples on Mrs. Gorf's desk. There were only 3 children left in the class. She must be the best teacher in the world, he thought. By the end of the week, all the children were apples. Mrs. Gorf was very happy. Now I can go home, she said. I don't have to teach anymore. I don't have to walk up 30 flights of stairs ever again. You're not going anywhere, shouted Todd. He jumped off the desk and bopped Mrs. Garf on the nose. The rest of the apples followed. Mrs. Garf fell on the floor. The apples jumped all over her. Stop, she shouted, or I'll turn you into applesauce. But apples didn't stop, and Mrs. Garf could not do anything about it. Turn us back to children, Todd demanded. Mrs. Garf had no choice. She stuck out her tongue, wiggled her ears, this time her left one first, then her right, and turned the apples back into children. All right, said Maricia. Let's go and get Louis. He'll know what to do. No, screamed Mrs. Garf. I'll turn you back into apples. She wiggled her ears, first the right one, then the left, then stuck out her tongue. But Jenny held up a mirror, and Mrs. Garf turned herself into an apple. The children didn't know what to do. They didn't have a teacher. Even though Mrs. Garf was mean, they didn't think it was right to leave her as an apple. But none of them knew how to wiggle their ears. Louis, the yard teacher, walked in. Where's Mrs. Garf? He asked. Nobody said a word. Boy, I'm hungry, said Louis. I don't think Mrs. Garf would mind if I ate this apple. After all, she's always has so many. He picked up an apple, which was really Mrs. Garf, shined it up on her shirt, and ate it. Chapter 2. Mrs. Jules. Mrs. Jules had a terribly nice face. She stood at the bottom of Wayside School and looked up. She was supposed to teach the class on 30th story. The children on the 30th story were scared. They had never told anybody what had happened to Mrs. Garf. They didn't have a teacher for 3 days. They were afraid what their new teacher would be like. They had heard she'd be a terribly nice teacher. They had never had a nice teacher. They were terribly afraid of nice teachers. Mrs. Jules walked up winding, cracking staircase in the 30th story. She was also afraid. She was afraid of children. She had heard that they would be horribly cute children. She would never touch cute children. She was horribly afraid of cute children. She opened the door to the classroom. She was terribly nice. The children could tell just by looking at her. Mrs. Jules looked at the children. They were horribly cute. In fact, they were much too cute to be children. I don't believe it, said Mrs. Jules. It's a room full of monkeys. The children looked at each other. They didn't see any monkeys. This is ridiculous, said Mrs. Jules. Just ridiculous. I walked all the way up to 30 flights of stairs for nothing but a class of monkeys. What do you think I am? I'm teacher, not a zookeeper. The children looked at her. They didn't know what to say. Todd scratched his head. Oh, I'm sorry, said Mrs. Jules. Please don't get me wrong. I have nothing against monkeys. It is just that I'm expecting children. I like monkeys. I really do. Why, I'm sure we can play all kinds of monkey games. What are you talking about? Said Todd. Mrs. Jules nearly fell off her chair. Well, what do you know, a talking monkey? Tomorrow I'll bring you a banana. My name is Todd, said Todd. The children were flabbergasted. They all raised their hands. I'm sorry, said Mrs. Jules, but I don't have enough bananas for all of you. I didn't expect this. Next week I will bring a whole bushel. I don't want a banana, said Calvin. I'm not a monkey. Would you like a peanut? Said Mrs. Jules. I think I might have a bag of peanuts in my purse. Wait a second. Yes, here it is. Thanks, says Calvin. Calvin liked peanuts. Allison stood up. I'm not a monkey, she said. I'm a girl. My name is Allison, and so everybody else. Mrs. Jules was shocked. Do you mean to tell me that every monkey in here is named Allison? No, said Jenny. She means we are all children. My name is Jenny. No, said Mrs. Jules. You're too cute to be children. Jason raised his hand. Yes, said Mrs. Jules. The chimpanzee in the red shirt. My name is Jason, said Jason, and I'm not a chimpanzee. You're too small to be a gorilla, said Mrs. Jules. I'm a boy, said Jason. You're not a monkey? Asked Mrs. Jules. No, said Jason. And the rest of the class, they're not monkeys either? Asked Mrs. Jules. No, said Allison. That is what we've been trying to tell you. Are you sure? Said Mrs. Jules. I know if we're monkeys, wouldn't we? Asked Calvin. I don't know, said Mrs. Jules. Do monkeys know that they are monkeys? I don't know, said Allison. I'm not a monkey. No, I suppose you're not, said Mrs. Jules. Okay, in that case, we have a lot of work to do. Reading, writing, subtraction, addition, spelling. Everybody take out a piece of paper. We'll have a test now. Jason tapped Todd on the shoulder. He said, Do you want to know something? I liked it better when she thought we were monkeys. I know, said Todd. I guess now it means she won't bring me a banana. There will be no talking in class, said Mrs. Jules. She wrote Todd's name on the blackboard under the word discipline. Chapter 3, Joe. Joe had a curly hair, but he didn't know how much hair he had. He couldn't count that high. In fact, he couldn't count at all. When all of the other children went to recess, Mrs. Jules told Joe to wait inside. Joe, she said, how much hair do you have? Joe shrugged his shoulders. A lot, he answered. But how much, Joe? Asked Mrs. Jules. Enough to cover my head, Joe answered. Joe, you're going to have to learn how to count, said Mrs. Jules. But Mrs. Jules, I already know how to count, said Joe. Let me go to recess. First, count to 10, said Mrs. Jules. Joe counted to 10. 6, 8, 12, 1, 5, 2, 7, 11, 3, 10. No, Joe, that is wrong, said Mrs. Jules. No, it isn't, said Joe. I counted until I got to 10. But you're wrong, said Mrs. Jules. I'll prove it to you. She had 5 pencils on the desk. How many pencils do we have here, Joe? Joe counted the pencils. 4, 6, 1, 9, 5. There are 5 pencils, Mrs. Jules. That's wrong, said Mrs. Jules. How many pencils are there? Joe asked. 5, said Mrs. Jules. That's what I said Joe. May I go to recess now? No, said Mrs. Jules. You got the right answer, but you counted the wrong way. You're just lucky. She said 8 potatoes on his desk. How many potatoes, Joe? Joe counted the potatoes. 7, 5, 3, 1, 2, 4, 6, 8. There are 8 potatoes, Miss Jules. No, there are 8, said Mrs. Jules. But that's what I said Joe. May I go to recess now? No, you got the right answer, but you counted the wrong way again. She put 3 books on his desk. Count the books, Joe. Joe counted the books. 1,000, 1,000,000, 3. 3, Mrs. Jules. Correct, said Mrs. Jules. May I go to recess now? Joe asked. No, said Mrs. Jules. May I have a potato? Asked Joe. No. Listen to me. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, said Mrs. Jules. Now you say it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, said Joe. Very good, said Mrs. Jules. She put 6 erasers on his desk. Now count those erasers, Joe, just the way I showed you. Joe counted the erasers. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, 7, 8, 9, 10. There are 10, Mrs. Jules. No, said Mrs. Jules. Didn't I count right? Said Joe. Yes, you counted right, but you got the wrong answer, said Mrs. Jules. It doesn't make any sense, said Joe. When I count the wrong way, I get the right answer, but when I count right, I get the wrong answer. Mrs. Jules hit her head against the wall 5 times. How many times did I hit my wall against the wall? She asked. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. You hit your head against the wall 10 times, said Joe. No, said Mrs. Jules. 4, 6, 1, 9, 5. You hit your head 5 times, said Joe. Mrs. Jules shook her head and said, Yes, that is right. The bell rang, and all the other children came back from recess. The fresh air made them very excited, and they were laughing and shouting. Oh, darn, said Joe. Now I missed recess. Hey, Joe, where are you? Asked John. You missed a great game of kickball. I kicked a home run, said Todd. What was wrong with you, Joe? Asked Joy. Nothing, said Joe. Mrs. Jules was just trying to teach me how to count. Joy asked, You mean you don't know how to count? Counting is easy, said Maricia. Now, said Mrs. Jules. It's easy for you, may not be easy for Joe, and what easy for Joe may not be easy for you. Nothing's easy for Joe, said Maricia. He's stupid. I can beat you up, said Joe. Try it, said Maricia. There will be enough of that, said Mrs. Jules. She wrote Maricia's name on the blackboard under the word discipline. Joe put his head on the desk between the 8 potatoes and the 6 erasers. Don't feel bad, Joe, said Mrs. Jules. I don't get it, said Joe. I'll never learn how to count. Sure you will, Joe, said Mrs. Jules. One day it will just come to you. You'll wake up one morning and suddenly be able to count. Joe asked, If all I have to do is wake up, when I'm going to school for? School just speeds things up, said Mrs. Jules. If I school, it might take another 70 years before you wake up and able to count. By the time I may have no hair left on top of my head to count, said Joe. Exactly, said Mrs. Jules. That is why you go to school. When Joe woke up the next day, he knew how to count. He had 55,006 hairs on his head. They were all curly. Chapter 4. Sherry. Sherry had long eyelashes. She weighed only 49 pounds. She always wore a big red and blue overcoat with a hood. The overcoat weighed 35 pounds. The red part weighed 15 pounds, and the blue part weighed 15 pounds, and the hood weighed 5 pounds. Her eyelashes weighed a pound and a half. She sat next to the window in Mrs. Jules' class. She spent a lot of time just staring out of the window. Mrs. Jules didn't mind. Mrs. Jules said a lot of people learn best when they stare out of a window. Shirley often fell asleep in class. Mrs. Jules didn't mind that either. She said a lot of people do their best learning when they're asleep. Shirley spent all her time either looking out of the window or sleeping. Mrs. Jules thought she was the best student in the class. One afternoon it was very hot. All of the windows were open, yet Shirley still wore her red and blue overcoat. The heat made her very tired. Mrs. Jules were teaching arithmetic. Shirley pulled the hood over her face, buried herself in the coat, and went to sleep. Mrs. Jules, said Kathy, Shirley is asleep. Very good, said Mrs. Jules. She must be learning something. Mrs. Jules continued with the lesson. Shirley began to snore. Mrs. Jules, Shirley is snoring, said Kathy. Yes, I can hear her, said Mrs. Jules. She must be learning an awful lot today. I wish rest of you could be like her. Shirley began to toss and turn. She flopped over on top of her desk, then rolled over to top of Kathy's desk. Then she rolled back another way. Kathy screamed. Shirley rolled out of the window. She was still sound asleep. As you know, Mrs. Jules' class was on the 30th story of Wayside School, so Shirley had a long way to go. After she had fallen 10 stories, Shirley woke up. She looked around. She was confused. She wasn't in Mrs. Jules' class. She wasn't at home in bed. She couldn't figure out where she was. She yawned, pulled her hood back over her eyes, and went back to sleep. By that time, she had fallen another 10 stories. Wayside School had an exceptionally large playground. Louis, the yard teacher, was way over on the other side of it when he happened to see Shirley fell out of the window. He ducked under the volleyball net, hurtled past the kickball field, hopped over the hopscotch court, climbed through the monkey bars, sped across the grass, and caught Shirley just before she hit the ground. The people in Mrs. Jules' class cheered. Shirley woke up in Lucy's arms. "Darn it, Louis," she said. "What did you go and wake me up for?" "I'm sorry, Shirley," said Louis. I'm sorry, Sir Shirley repeated. "Is that all you can say? I'm having a wonderful dream until you woke me up. You're always bothering me, Louis. I can't stand it." She laughed and hugged him around the neck. Louis carried her back up 30 flights of stairs to Mrs. Jules' room. That evening, when Shirley went to bed, she was unable to fall asleep. She was just weren't tired. Todd. All of the children in Mrs. Joe's class except Todd were talking on and carrying on. Todd was thinking. Todd always thought before he spoke. When he got an idea, his eyes lit up. Todd finished thinking and began to speak, but before he had 2 words, Mrs. Jules called him. Todd, she said, you know better than to talk in class. You must learn to work quietly. Like other children, she wrote his name on the blackboard under the word discipline. Todd looked around in amazement. All of the other children who had been talking and screaming and fighting only seconds earlier was quietly working in their workbooks. Todd scratched his head. A child was given 3 chances in Mrs. Jules' class. The first time he did something wrong, Mrs. Jules wrote his name on the blackboard under the word discipline. The second time he did something wrong, she put a check next to his name. Then the third time he did something wrong, she circled his name. Todd reached into his desk and pulled out of the workbook. He had only just started on it when had someone tap on him in the shoulder. It was Joy. What page are you on? Joy asked. Page 4, Todd whispered. I'm on page 11, said Joy. Todd didn't say anything. He did not want to get into trouble. He just went back to work. 5 minutes later, Joy tapped him again. Todd ignored her. So Joy poked him on the back with her pencil. Todd pretended he didn't notice. Joy got up from her seat and sharpened her pencil. She came back and poked it with Todd's back. What page are you on? She asked. Page 5, Todd answered. Boy, are you dumb, said Joy. I'm on page 29. It isn't a race, Todd whispered. 5 minutes later, Joy pulled Todd's hair and he didn't let go until he turned around. What page are you on? She demanded. Page 6, Todd answered as quietly as he could. I'm on page 200, Joy shouted. Todd was very angry. Will you please let me do my work and stop bothering me? Mrs. Jules heard him. Todd, what did I say about talking in class? Todd scratched his head. Mrs. Jules put a check next to Todd's name on the blackboard under the word discipline. Todd really tried to be good. He knew that if he talked in more time, Mrs. Jules would be circle his name. Then he'd have to go home early at 12 o'clock on the kindergarten bus, just as he was had the day before that. In fact, there hadn't been a day before since Mrs. Jules took over the class that she didn't send Todd home early. She said she did it for his own good. The other children went home at 2 o'clock. Todd wasn't really bad. He was always got caught. He really wanted to stay past 12 o'clock. He wanted to find out the class did from 12 to 2. But it didn't look as though he was going to be his day. It was only 10:30 and he already got 2 strikes against him. He sealed her lips and went back to work. There was a knock on the door. Mrs. Jules opened it. 2 men stepped in wearing masks, holding guns. Give us all your money, they demanded. All I have is a nickel, said Mrs. Jules. I have a dime, said Mauricia. I have 13 cents, said Leslie. I have 4 cents, said Damien. What kind of bank is this? Asked one of the robbers. It's not a bank, it's a school, said Todd. Can't you read? No, said the robbers. Neither can I, said Todd. Do you mean we walked all the way up 30 flights of stairs for nothing? Asked the robber. Don't you have anything valuable? Todd's eyes lit up. We sure do, he said. We have knowledge. He grabbed Joy's workbook and gave to the robbers. Knowledge is much more valuable than money. Thanks, kid, said one of the robbers. Maybe I'll give up being a criminal and become a scientist, said the other. They left the room without hurting anybody. Now I don't have a workbook, complained Joy. Mrs. Jules gave a new one. Joy had to start all the way back from the beginning. Hey, Joy, what page are you on? Asked Todd. Page 1, Joy said. I'm on page 8, laughed Todd triumphantly. Mrs. Jules heard him. She circled his name. Todd had 3 strikes against him. At 12 o'clock, he left the room to go home early on the kindergarten bus. But this time when he left, he was like a star baseball player leaving the field. All the children stood up, clapping their hands, and whistled. Todd scratched his head.